years ago, in 2000, I want to say 8, the roguelike community got together at a convention somewhere in Berlin, and they did something called, created something that was called the Berlin interpretation. And the Berlin interpretation of roguelikes was basically an effort to define what a roguelike is. I think this is a really interesting concept, because like we talk about fighting game adjacent games, and like if Ninja is a fighting game adjacent game, what makes it not just a fighting game? What makes it adjacent to? But like, if we're gonna answer what makes it a fighting game, we have to know what a fighting game is, right? And so the Berlin interpretation was a collection of like features or values for the games, the roguelike games. And you had high order values and low order values, right? And if you had enough of a mix of these components, then you could be classified as a roguelike. Now, missing any one of these features wouldn't disqualify you, and even including a lot of them wouldn't necessarily make you one. But it's like a way to like narrow the definition, because like we said, like we know what a fighting game is when we see it, right? We do it based on vibes, but it's like in our head, like we're not mentally considering all these factors, but they're in our brain somewhere, and our brain is like, yep, enough of them, fighting game. What are these values? What are these factors that make a fighting game? And so the Berlin interpretation was interesting because it went from the back forward, where everyone knows what some roguelikes are, right? Like Rogue is obviously a roguelike, right? But there were a series of other games as well that were kind of foundational for the genre. And basically those can like unequivocally be considered roguelikes, right? And so what we're going to do is, since we're coming from the other direction, we're going to have to think about, we don't have our set of canon games, right? Like the Berlin interpretation was working. We have our canon roguelike games. There are 5 of them, and we can move forward with our definitions. So we're coming from the other way. So we're like, all right, Ninja is a fighting game adjacent game. Look, there's these movement text. There's this like asymmetrical character archetypes. There's, right, the head-to-head component, the strict round structure. Like there are all these things that make it fighting gamey, which makes my brain say it's fighting game adjacent at the very least. So if we move back again, what are the games that unequivocally, that like, if you could show this game to anybody and ask them what the genre was, and they would likely say fighting games, right? And I think it's fair to say Street Fighter is the obvious choice, right? Right? And what are some of the things about Street Fighter that make it an obvious choice? Life bars of some type. A very clear, discrete win condition for the round, vitality, or ring outs, right? But to decide which of these factors are essential, should they be high order factors or low order factors, right? Because Smash Brothers doesn't have a health bar, but I would say Smash Brothers is pretty unequivocally a fighting game. So I think a good way to approach this is we need to decide on a few things, right? We need to decide, what are the canon games? What are the list of games that set the tone for any game that comes after? Like those are going to be the ones. Your canonical games are going to be the ones that everyone else strives to. And it's kind of an interesting thing, right? Because like you think about it, like first-person shooters. First-person shooters is a broad genre these days, but what did they used to be called? They used to be called Doom clones, right? Because Doom is very much a canonical first-person shooter. If you had to pick any game, any one game, and say, what is an FPS? You'd be like, Doom, right? This is it. Same for Street Fighter and fighting game. What's a fighting game? Street Fighter is a fighting game. No one's going to argue that Street Fighter isn't a fighting game, right? So, but like Doom kind of solidified it, was a canonical game that was like, this is genre defining. And then games that came after were Doom clones, because the genre hadn't actually solidified, right? Through these Doom clones and the conventions that developers used in making new additions to the genre, they solidified what the genre was. And some of those developers went in different directions. You got Doom, you got Unreal, you got Quake. And then going forward, you got into first-person shooters. They were no longer Doom clones because they weren't trying to clone Doom, but they were very clearly of a lineage, right? And so they became first-person. So we have canonical games that move into clones, right? Street Fighter knockoffs, that was a common one. And then it was just fighting games, right? And then you get into specific things. For first-person shooters, you moved into like the squad-based shooters. You moved into immersive sims. You got stuff like System Shock and Thief, which are very much not like Doom, but are very much first-person shooters. You go further down the line, much further, and you get things like Portal, which Portal is very much a first-person shooter, but it's a puzzle adventure game, right? And so you have canonical games, which are pretty like tightly like limited in terms of what it is, and then you have games based on them which expand the genre. So if we're going to decide what a fighting game is, then we got to decide what our canonical fighting games are, what features they have that define the genre as it expanded, and then look at games today and see how far away from that are they. Life bars is one of those aspects, one of those things that makes a fighting game, but life bars can take on different forms, right? So what should the higher order or lower order value be health bars? Should it be vitality gauge? Because that would include things like a percentage for like an attack percent in a Smash Brothers game, right? Functions very similarly, and I think that's, once again, the genre expanded from fighting games or 2D fighters, Street Fighter clones into platform fighters with Smash Brothers. And Smash Brothers decided to answer the question of health bars are a part of fighting games and changed it with the percentage gauge, right? Yes, because it's not strictly defined, right? But once again, it doesn't have to be. Soul Calibur is a game that lets you win via ring out. So there is a vitality gauge, but you could ignore it completely. Soul Calibur is not a fighting game because you don't have to do it, right? And Soul Calibur also has this aspect of ring out to win the round, right? Which then parallels blast zones in Smash Brothers. So there's like this connection there, right? But once again, no one factor. You think if you end up with 15, 20 different factors that decide what is a fighting game, no one factor is absolutely disqualifying. This is what I wanted to broach this with the community in the chat now and say, start thinking about what are the games that for you scream fighting games. Like I said, if you were presented with the game and someone said, this game is not a fighting game, you would say you are wrong, right? Like if someone came to me and said Mortal Kombat is not a fighting game, I would say you are incorrect, sir. It is. And so I think we have some foundation. I will venture a guess and say Street Fighter, Tekken, Mortal Kombat, right? These are three games that were very early in defining the broadness of fighting games as opposed to defining Street Fighter clones, right? They all introduced aspects of fighting games that we know and understand. Virtua Fighter, gonna be up there. Guilty Gear could probably be up there. You got Battle K Road, and this is it. You will always come across exceptions to the rule. This is why this conversation is so fascinating to me and why I want to have it. I think it's one really important thing to note. Like the Berlin interpretation is a really interesting thought experiment. It is a really bad tool as a strict definition, right? Like the idea of one of these kinds of interpretations is not to prescriptively define what it is, but it's a tool to assess what something is as you're doing it. It's also a tool to consider the broader scope of the genre, right? If you want to think in terms of game design and you think to yourself, this isn't really a fighting game, well, if you have let's call it the basement interpretation. If you have the basement interpretation of fighting games, and you can then apply your game and your design thoughts to that interpretation and say, we got a lot of these high order values that make it fighting gamey, and a lot of these lower order values that make it pretty fighting gamey too. It might be at least fighting game adjacent, right? If that's how you want to position your game, or if that's what the direction you want to go in, if you want to embrace some nature of fighting games in your game when you're not making explicitly a fighting game, one of these kinds of interpretations is a great tool to be able for you to assess how your different features and components and design philosophies are interacting with each other. Most fighters, you can see you and your opponent's avatar is hidden. No information is hidden. Yep. Right? There are sometimes stun meter is hidden. Sometimes it's a 3D fighting game and you can lose perspective. Sometimes there are environmental aspects which can occlude vision, right? But you're right. it's a pretty fundamental component to it, right? And this is so funny, because this is it. And this is why I say, thank you, Punk. Is Pong a fighting game, right? This is, when it comes down to it, you can use one of these interpretations to justify fucking anything as a fighting game, right? Tetris, fighting game. Mario Kart, a fighting game. FIFA, a fighting game, right? Like, Pong, 100% a fighting game. Like, why wouldn't it be, right? Yeah, there's all these exceptions to the rule, which is why it's not meant to be a prescriptive tool. It's meant to be a tool to engage in a thought experiment, right? And I think it clarifies some things. Like, when I think about, okay, like, I'm going to take a quick example, right? Where I'm like, we don't have our list of definitions of higher or lower values. We haven't decided on all that. But I have some of them in my head that I have decided on at thinking through this stuff, right? Super Dodgeball for the Neo Geo. It's a Kunio-kun dodgeball sports game, right? It's a fighting game. It is a 3v3 team fighting game. You have special attacks, you have motion inputs, you have supers, you have meter management, you have frame data and advantage and recovery and Oki and, right? Like, you have all these components which are fundamental. You like the type of, it's a head-to-head game. It has the same visual perspective, very little occluded information. You have like asymmetrical character archetypes, all these components which I personally have ascribed these things to. We'll do it communally. Don't worry, we will. But like, all of those things are the things that I love about fighting games, and they're present, and not only present, but like front and center in Super Dodgeball as a game. Windjammers, yes, thank you, Sunshine. Windjammers is another amazing example where it's like, yeah, I call Windjammers a fighting game adjacent game, because it's not technically a fighting game, but it's a fighting game. Like, all of those things, the motion inputs, the asymmetry, the head-to-head nature, the lack of hidden information, all those things make it a fighting game, right? And it's like, but all those things also make WCW or whatever, NWA Nitro or whatever the hell those N64 wrestling games were, also fighting games, right? And they're not actually, I would say, but they're adjacent to, they're really close to. You'll see a lot of fighting game players play those wrestling games and love them because they do a lot of the things that we love out of fighting games. So I think creating this kind of like the basement interpretation is what I'm going to call it, is a really interesting thought experiment. I would love. I want to make sure everyone's in chat for this, that we got all the developers, all the writers, all the fans, the players, and everyone in there getting their opinion on, right? Because yeah, KO. Otherwise, who knows any game? So you like Street Fighter, and it could be like, oh, like boxing? Yeah, right? And it's funny because I think when you look at like genre categories in like an online store, like you go to Steam and you look at fighting games and they're giving you Sifu and a like Castlevania game that's not Castlevania Judgment. And you're like, why? Right? But there are some aspects of fighting games, martial arts, hand-to-hand combat, versus all these things which appear in these other games. So the store does the Berlin interpretation and uses it in the worst possible way. So like, once again, I want to be perfectly clear. Like, I am not trying to do this to be like, and I am the decider. I have decided that you are not a fighting game and you are banished from the community. No, that's not what this is about. But it's a really important thought experiment, right? I think used well, it could be very informative, especially looking at yourself and what you like and what you think is good. Why do I consider some rhythm games closer to fighting games than some martial arts games? There's something about that. And if you set up this like this kind of dichotomy and these tiers of high and low order values and create this kind of interpretation, you can answer some of those questions. What are your canonical fighting games? What games belong in the fighting game canon, right? The games that are fundamentally, they are intrinsically fighting games, right? And I think we can come up with a list of maybe 5, maybe 10 at the most. We don't want too many in our canon, but 5, say 8 games that are like unimpeachably fighting games. And then we will then go through them and decide what aspects of those games make them unimpeachably fighting games. And then we can organize it, right? We can give ourselves the higher, which are the most important ones, where if you have enough of these, if you have 3 of these, you're most likely a fighting game. But maybe you have 15 low order values and none of the high ones. But enough low order values can maybe push you over the edge. And then we're gonna do some thought experiments, and we're gonna pick games that are either obviously not fighting games or considered regularly fighting game adjacent, right? The twinkle star sprites of the world. And we're gonna apply this interpretation to those games to see which of these components line up. How much do they line up, and in what ways, right? And maybe we'll be able to find something new and interesting about these games through that process. Oh, and I love it, because you're right, it brings up all these things where even if they're not foundational, even if they're not intrinsic, it brings up all these interesting things where you start thinking about games and say, oh, they did do that differently. They had plane switching. Oh, they did do that differently. They were the first ones to have a comeback mechanic, right? They were like a rage meter or whatever the case may be. You start realizing things about the games that we discuss regularly, and how they are placed in context of all the other games and all the other features of the genre. So if there's one thing I want to do, I want to be able to kind of expand the discussion. Less discourse, more discussion. I want to be able to expand on that. And I think that's what this is going to do. So there you go, folks. You have the assignment. Go forth, come back. We'll do the FGCUniversity again. It'll be good.